Seltzer Kings.
Podcasts.
I found a kid who swings a golf club like a dream. I'd like to try to qualify him for the U.S. Amateurs.
Coming to Apple TV Plus.
What's your name?
I'm not into older guys, but I'm flattered.
A new comedy series, Stick.
I don't want to go on this trip.
Your mouth's saying one thing, but those eyes are saying something else.
From the home of Ted Lasso.
This is your shot at redemption? This is your mulligan?
Owen Wilson.
This game takes and it takes. The game's finally giving me something back.
Stick.
You know Arnold Palmer?
Iced tea, lemonade, mix it.
I'm missing a nap for this.
Streaming June 4th on Apple TV Plus.
Hi, pod friends. It's me, Dave. If you're hearing my voice before I insult Gavin and tell you that there are swear words in a podcast, then you know it's a rerun. But that's okay, because I just spent 6 weeks talking about cocaine, and frankly, I need to come down off all the cocaine. And also, I got one in the hopper for you. Woo! I'm reading an actual book about it, which should frighten you, actually, when you think about it, because you know that's probably going to be a 2 or 3-parter as well. But until then, well, here's a rerun from episode 400 and 401, celebrated a major milestone, talking about a man that, well, we all know and we hate, Ronald Reagan.
He said it.
Enjoy. No, Gavin. No, I'm never, ever going to let you do a 9-part deep dive on Margaret Thatcher. Yes. The following podcast contains...
Only I didn't say fudge.
And for gosh sake, watch your language.
Watch your profanity.
Right, I'm sorry.
explicit language. Hello and welcome to the podcast that asks a simple question. When you decided to celebrate your 400th episode by covering the guy you actually hate, what the hell were you thinking? I'm your host, Dave Bledsoe, and this is episode 400, Win One for the Gipper, part 1 of Ronald Wilson Reagan, the bête noire of this dumb show. Stay tuned. What the Hell Are You Thinking podcast is brought to you by the Simeon Actors Guild, who want you to know, later info for the guy. The Simeon Actors Guild, representing great apes appearing in films and television, have a long history of supporting progressive politics, unions, and freedom for all hominids to live in freedom and dignity. Despite our reluctant appearances in some famous movies with an objectionable human, no Simeon supported with donation or votes in any of his political campaigns, nor any other politicians who enable the kind of hate and repression demonstrated by that former president. We were contractually obligated to appear in those films. The Simeon Actors Guild, we may be apes, but we refuse to be tools for the far right.
Why do Oregonians want Governor Reagan for president?
I was Republican state chairman in Oregon during our victories of 1966. In 1968, I am for Governor Reagan for president because we need a winner in the Republican Party nationally. Governor Reagan is a proven winner.
Because he offers the kind of new, dynamic, creative leadership this country needs. He's the one candidate who can unite the people and the Republican Party in November.
Because I believe that he has the leadership and the ability that this country has been lacking, and that this is what it will take to win in November.
Because the Republican Party wants and needs a winner. He's already demonstrated his vote-getting ability in the California gubernatorial election. I think he can do the same for president.
Do you want a Republican winner in November? Then you want Governor Reagan. On primary day, let's put him on the ticket. Vote Reagan.
My parents fucking loved Ronald Reagan.
He said it.
Just getting that out of the way. They still fucking love Ronald Reagan. When I post the socials of this episode, I will get a response reminding me that Ronald Reagan saved the Bledsoe family.
That's not entirely accurate.
I would argue that the Vietnam-era GI Bill, my parents' hard work and struggle while my dad finished college, and a fortuitous encounter with an Air Force recruiter had a hell of a lot more to do with my family rising to solid middle class than anything Ronald Reagan ever did. This is largely because all of that happened before Ronald Reagan ever took office. Why do my parents feel as though they owe Reagan for their hard work and good fortune?
Marketing, super.
Nor was I immune to the marketing of the Gipper during the '84 election when my high school government class assigned a project to explain who you would vote for. Could you vote? Would you like to guess who I supported?
Walter Mondale and the Cleveland Indians.
No, don't be ridiculous. No one supported Mondale. Mondale was an anthropomorphic manifestation of the color beige. Mondale was so blandly generic that more than half of his campaign stops were performed by an unclothed department store mannequin, and no one noticed or cared. Mondale was a political comma, a brief pause in the run-on sentence that was the Reagan Revolution. So, of course, I was a dyed-in-the-wool Reagan kid. I gave a speech in class extolling the virtues of a strong national defense, sound fiscal policy, and how only the Gipper could stand up to the Soviet menace.
How could you?
How could I not? Everyone was saying it. The entire United States was horny on Maine for Ronald Reagan. 4 years later, the first presidential ballot I ever cast was for Reagan's number one boy, George Herbert Walker Bush. I was a stan for the Reagan administration.
So, what happened?
Oh, it was the war. I mean, there were a lot of things, but mostly it was the war. I mentioned in episode 393 and 394 that I wasn't exactly convinced by the casus belli of our little adventure in the Persian Gulf, and once I started questioning that, a lot of things seemed a little dubious for the previous dozen years. I wasn't much of a researcher back then, and probably none of that has changed, but I'd learned enough to go that maybe this Reagan guy wasn't exactly what he'd been made out to be, that just maybe he was,
Because he's kind of a dick, right? Right?
Which is why, for the auspicious episode 400, I'm going to finally dig into why Reagan was such a huge dick. Now, I normally begin with a biography of a man, so here's the biography of the man. Born February 6, 1911 in Tampico, Illinois to Jack and Nellie Reagan, he was brought up in a very religious home, the Disciples of Christ, to be specific.
Never heard of him.
That's probably because the church was more concerned with doing things that Jesus Christ, if he existed, might actually approve of. They were followers of a social gospel, meaning they applied Christian ethics to social justice issues like economic inequality, poverty, alcoholism, crime, racial tension, slums, unclean environment, and child labor, the lack of unionization, poor schools, and the dangers of war. You know, pretty much the
total opposite
of everything Reagan, the president, actually stood for. Hell, young Ronald Reagan even invited 2 black football players from his college teams to stay with his parents when the local hotel refused to let them stay there. Though, in later years, Reagan would claim that he grew up unaware of the race problem in America. After college, he began working as a radio sports broadcaster doing play-by-play for the Chicago Cubs. And during spring training in 1936, while traveling to California, Reagan took a screen test and landed a contract at Warner Brothers. In those early years, Reagan was the very definition of a B-list actor until he starred as George Gipp in Newt Rockne, All-American.
Rock, someday when the team's up against it, breaks are beating the boys, ask them to go in there with all they've got. Win just one for the Gipper.
Yeah, that's the only line I know from it, even I've never even seen the fucking movie. In 1942, Reagan was on the fast track to stardom by being named one of the top 100 stars of 1941, but then things took a turn. What with that whole World War and all. Reagan was not one of those Hollywood actors who did genuine hero shit during the war, but that wasn't entirely his fault. He was severely nearsighted, though he would never admit it by publicly wearing glasses. He was actually in the Army Reserve and listed as far back as 1937 as a private in the cavalry, but was quickly bumped up to an officer and in the reserve at the rank of lieutenant. He received a deferment from the initial call-ups of early 1942 to finish a film, but once he wrapped that up, he reported for duty. And what did Ronald Reagan do during the war?
Well, I shoveled shit in Louisiana.
Well, technically, he was shoveling shit in Burbank, and that shit was training films for the Army, of which he did over 400. After the war, Reagan was elected, not to public office, but the president of the Screen Actors Guild.
He was more than a hero. He was a union man.
Well, let's not start Nancy and his dick just yet. SAG is hardly the AFL-CIO, and Reagan was hardly a staunch representative for his union brothers. When the FBI came calling to asking if Ronnie knew of any commies in the guild, well, Ronnie...
You got me blacklisted at Hop Sings? She named name.
He would testify before the House Un-American Activities that he was aware of communist activities in SAG, but call the charges of commies in the Screenwriters Guild hearsay. His first Senate stag ran from 1947 to 1952, and he would do a second stint as president from 59 to 60. Politically, Ronnie was a New Dealer. He called FDR a true hero. I have to pause here just to point out that I took much of this info from his Wikipedia page, and about every third fucking line, someone has added into the page how often Reagan spoke out against racism.
Methinks he doth protest too much.
He even planned to attend an anti-nuclear rally in 1945, but was supposedly stopped from attending by Warner Brothers. He supported Harry Truman's campaign in 48 and voted the Democratic ticket in the congressional elections in California. All in all, Ronald Reagan could best be described as a...
He's just another Hollywood liberal big shot.
And remained so until 1952.
What changed?
Let's just say that a blowjob is a powerful persuader. And Nancy Davis was allegedly one of the best blowjobs in Hollywood. Now, what I just said is unsubstantiated and not a little misogynist, but at the same time, fuck Nancy Reagan. Nancy's politics were to the right of Ronnie's from the get-go. She was described as a staunch right-wing conservative. She loved the company of rich, famous people. So Nancy helped him along in his rightward shift. She took him to speeches by ardent anti-communist actors in Hollywood and can credibly be attributed to a big part of Reagan's rightward shift. But you know what else cranked Ronnie's tractor besides that sweet mouth action? Communism. Reagan was terrified of communists taking over America. But more than that, more than anything else, the real thing behind Ronnie's shift to the right was Reagan was no longer a star. Let's be clear. Ronald Reagan, as an actor...
Not very good.
Oh, he was a decent enough supporting actor. He could hit his marks and remember his lines, but his range was limited. If Marlon Brando was a precision sniper rifle, Ronald Reagan was more a
BB gun.
Quoting from filmcomment.com in a piece written back in 1987, quote, Reagan was clearly not a distinguished actor, though he was a sometimes respectable one. He was just as often an incompetent one. He succeeded as an actor in the theatrical sense of the word precisely because he refused to act in the general sense of the word. He refused to try and impose himself on events to shape them to his uses. Rather, he succeeded because he correctly saw his movie career as a lucky opportunity proffered by rich and powerful men more clever than he was. He lived with one of those delicious American fantasies. All he had to do, as he saw it, was to go along and do everything with them agreeably. Show up on time, learn his lines, submit to the publicity process, and above all, not question the wisdom of their decisions about his career, unquote. Reagan's movies were all banal studio productions written not so much to create art, but to hit target numbers for X number of films released in a year. Reagan was pleasant and inoffensive, passably charming, and utterly willing to toe the company line in order to receive a paycheck. None of this makes him objectively a bad person or a bad actor, but it doesn't make him a good one either. Which is why when he made the jump to television in 1954, and Ronnie did not want to do television, at the time it was where the washed-up has-beens of the film industry quietly faded away in moderately paid obscurity. But when the only other jobs he could get were nightclub gigs, he signed on to host the General Electric Theater Company on CBS television.
Good evening. I am Ronald Reagan speaking for General Electric. Tonight from Hollywood, it is my pleasure to appear in a story entitled The Dark, Dark Hours. Young James Dean, one of the bright new actors in Hollywood, appears with me, and Constance Ford plays my wife on the General Electric Theater.
The show was actually kind of good and featured many up-and-coming actors and was well-regarded and well-watched. It aired for nearly a decade. It wasn't the television show that changed the future for old Dutch Reagan. Yeah, that was his actual nickname. They didn't start calling him the Gipper until the 1980s. What changed old Dutch was his side gig for General Electric, motivational speaking.
And I live in a van down by the river.
Quoting now from an article on LitHub, quote, besides hosting the Sunday evening broadcast of GE Theater, Reagan served as a corporate pitchman and roving goodwill ambassador for GE, traveling at least 16 weeks a year. It was this work that drove his metamorphosis from actor to politician. He visited all of GE's 139 plants across the U.S. and delivered thousands of speeches to approximately 250,000 employees. Afraid of flying at the time, Reagan traveled by train. The long rides afforded him the opportunity to read right-wing fare, including the journal's Human Events and Reader's Digest books, such as Whittaker Chambers' Witness and F.A. Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. and his favorite bi-weekly periodical, the National Review. Reagan looked back on his GE years as a postgraduate course in political science and an apprenticeship for public life, unquote. Reagan's GE speeches had three basic themes. General Electric was a great place to work, unions were bad, and communism was trying to take over America and get workers to believe the first two things were not true. If you have seen 30 Rock, you are familiar with the kind of thing Reagan was trying to instill in the workers of General Electric.
This is a Six Sigma wheel of domination. It's a motivational tool I used back at GE, and it will be replacing Cabletown's kitten and spaghetti.
In those very well-compensated speeches, Reagan's lingering drops of New Deal liberalism were slurped away like Nancy.
Dave, no!
Fine. Let's just say he became committed to the ideals he would go on to represent as believing when he ran for later political office. And those speeches culminated in what came to be known as the speech, where Ronald Reagan endorsed Barry Goldwater for president in 1964.
Property or business to impose socialism on a people? What does it mean whether you hold the deed to the title to your business or property if the government holds the power of life and death over that business or property? And such machinery already exists. The government can find some charge to bring against any concern it chooses to prosecute. Every businessman has his own tale of harassment. Somewhere a perversion has taken place. Our natural unalienable rights are now considered to be a dispensation of government. And freedom has never been so fragile, so close to slipping from our grasp as it is at this moment.
The speech, titled A Time for Choosing, was mostly right-wing masturbatory fantasy and capitalist agitprop delivered by a competent public speaker with thousands of hours of speechifying under his belt. It didn't help Barry Goldwater, who had Lyndon Johnson wipe the floor with him during the '64 election. But here's the thing. Ronnie wasn't really endorsing Barry Goldwater in that speech.
What was he doing?
That speech, filled with all that bullshit, was Reagan's coming out party. Because he wasn't there to tell you about how great Barry Goldwater was. He was there to be
being an insatiable cock tease.
Because after his years of stumping around for GE and being the supporting actor, Ronald Reagan was ready for his close-up. He was running for office. In 1966, Ronald Reagan announced that he would be running for the governor of the great state of California. That state was not the hotbed of libtard pedophile kleptocrats that it is today, pod friends, being, for the most part, very much a swing state, and it didn't become Democratic stronghold until 1992. In 66, incumbent Governor Pat Brown had been extremely popular in the state, trouncing none other than Dick Nixon in the 1962 governor's race. He was even considered as a running mate for Johnson in 64, but by 1966, he was in trouble. He had promised not to seek a third term, and here he was seeking a third term. The growing campus protest movement of the 60s didn't like his politics, but the nail in Pat Brown's political coffin was the Watts riot. The Watts riot made the Rodney King riots look like a silent vigil held by nuns in comparison, and it scared the ever-loving shit out of white people.
Look, you're scaring the white people.
And scared white people were the target Reagan voter. Quoting from Wikipedia, quote, Reagan's general election opponent Pat Brown attempted to label Reagan as an extremist and tout his own accomplishment. Reagan portrayed himself as a political outsider and charged Brown as responsible for the Watts riots and lenient on crime. In numerous speeches, Reagan hit the Brown administrations about high taxes, uncontrolled spending, the radicals at the University of California, Berkeley, and the need for accountability in government. Meanwhile, many in the press perceived Reagan as monumentally ignorant of state issues. Though a guy named Lou Cannon said that Reagan benefited from an appearance he and Brown made on Meet the Press in September of that year. Ultimately, Reagan won the governorship with 57% of the vote compared to Brown's 42%, unquote. Reagan came into office and immediately began working on his two main goals, balancing the budget and reducing the deficit. All things that Ronald Reagan liked to say he did while doing the exact opposite. What was interesting was Reagan's chosen method for balancing the budget and reducing the deficit. He raised taxes.
You did what now?
Yeah, he raised taxes. More from Wikipedia, quote, as a result, taxes on sales, banks, corporate profits, inheritances, liquor, and cigarettes jumped. Historian Kevin Starr states Reagan gave California the biggest tax hike in history and got away with it, unquote. If you are confused as to how the president that slashed taxes and drove up the United States budget deficit to historical proportion is the same one that was the governor of California, you need to know that at that point in time, Reagan still had some modicum of principles. I assure you, he tossed those aside as soon as it became politically convenient. Ronald Reagan was kind of a liberal when it comes to being governor. He passed one of the strictest gun control laws in United States history.
No fucking way.
Yeah, but that was really only because black people realized the Second Amendment applied to them as well, and white people got fucking scared.
You scaring the white people?
It banned public carry of weapons and instituted a 15-day waiting period on all firearms purchases. Reagan's gun law was the impetus for the NRA beginning its long campaign to get as many Americans killed by guns as possible. And credit where credit is due, it's one of the most successful programs of mass murder not involved during an actual war in human history. Dare to dream big, folks. Hell, Reagan even signed an abortion law in 1967. Just not the kind of law you think he did, because it expanded abortion access.
Mind blown.
Yeah, providing legal abortions in the case of rape, incest, and to save the life of a mother. Although, in later years, Reagan regretted his one tiny act of human decency. Now, lest you think Big Ron was all liberal and such, he also gutted state welfare programs, closed state-funded mental hospitals, which directly contributed to California having so many fun serial killers during his time as governor and afterwards. And if you doubt me on that one, look up the name Richard Chase. He cut school funding and primary and secondary education because an educated voter is a Democratic voter. In response to student protest on campus, he turned loose the California National Guard, saying, quote, if it takes a bloodbath, let's get it over with. No more appeasement, unquote. Yes, that is a direct quote from Ronald fucking Reagan. Less than a month after Reagan said that, National Guard troops massacred unarmed students in Kent State and Ohio. Reagan reportedly said,
Q, I'm so jealous. I am so jealous.
But throughout all of this, Ron kept his eyes on the big prize, the presidency. He was an unofficial candidate in the GOP primary of 1968, where he hoped to win enough delegates to be seen as a compromise candidate to Nixon in a brokered convention, but Nixon had the votes. In 1976, he went all in on a primary challenge against incumbent Gerald Ford. Running to the right of Ford, Reagan began his first dalliances with the shittiest wing of the GOP. This is when his true colors came shining through. He used black people to scare white people. And it worked. It worked great for him in California. Again, from Wikipedia, quote, beginning with New Hampshire, he popularized the welfare queen narrative about Linda Taylor, exaggerating her misuse of welfare benefits and igniting voter resentment of welfare reform. But he never overtly mentioned her race. He just sort of hinted at it. In California, Reagan referred to a man morphing into a strapping young buck after buying steaks with food stamps. Steaks are food, I just want you to know that. Which became an example of dog whistle politics. Uniting with Jesse Helms' political machine that viciously attacked Ford, Reagan won an upset victory, convincing party delegates that Ford's nomination was no longer guaranteed. Reagan won subsequent victories in Texas, Alabama, Georgia, Indiana by continuing to attack social programs, opposing forced busing, accumulating support from declining George Wallace presidential campaign, unquote. George Wallace and Jesse Helms, for you youngins, were virulent racists and complete sacks of shit in every way imaginable, just like Ronald Reagan. And though Ford managed to squeak through the nomination, Reagan would go on to stab him in the back during the convention by giving a speech that pretty much implied that they had nominated the wrong guy and this guy was going to go on to lose to Jimmy Carter, which admittedly is exactly what happened, but Ford always blamed Reagan for that speech because Reagan was definitely fucking over Ford when he gave it. Which set up 1980, where Reagan would face off against Carter for president. And that's where we'll pick up next week for part 2 of the many lives and lives of Ronald Wilson Reagan.
Whatever the occasion, effortless elegance is right this way. Because Hilton brings you new ways to stay courtesy of the Nomad London. And it doesn't stop at award-winning dining in a space draped in velvet and illuminated by vintage chandeliers. No, this day goes beyond with unparalleled personalized service and attentive hospitality. Oh, and did we mention the Nomad London can be booked using your Hilton Honors points at Hilton.com? Hilton, for this day.
Is anyone out there?
Another salesperson enduring the endless search. Exhausting. If you want to get right to the right conversations, you need LinkedIn Sales Navigator. Whether you're looking for new leads or strengthening existing relationships at your top accounts, get right to the right conversations with LinkedIn Sales Navigator. Try LinkedIn Sales Navigator now with a free 60-day trial at linkedin.com/trial. That's linkedin.com/trial.
Terms and conditions apply!
Hello and welcome to the podcast that asks a simple question. When you were gonna beat the guy anyway, but you still had to do some crimes? What the hell were you thinking? I'm your host, Dave Bledsoe, and this is episode number 401. It's Morning Again in America, part 2 of the many lives and lies of Ronald Wilson Reagan. Stay tuned. The What the Hell Were You Thinking podcast is brought to you by The Timeline, where Jimmy Carter won. We want you to know where we are. Things are fucking great. The Timeline where Jimmy Carter won had all the boom benefits of the 80s and none of the downsides. AIDS? We cured that in 1991. Wars in the Persian Gulf? Yeah, those never happened. Global warming? Well, in the Timeline where Jimmy Carter won, we met your 2030 climate goals in 2004. Sure, some things are still the same, like we had the dot-com crash in 2000, but we passed a whole bunch of laws reining in Wall Street after that. So in 2008, we just elected Barack Obama, but he wasn't the first black president. He was just the first black male president. And yeah, we had COVID, but since we never elected Reagan, our CDC was on top of things for the jump, and we had a max 5% of the casualties you had because we have universal health care. All because we re-elected Jimmy Carter. The Timeline where Jimmy Carter won. Things aren't perfect, but they're a hell of a lot better than where you are.
It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history. With interest rates at about half the record highs of 1980, nearly 2,000 families today will buy new homes, more than at any time in the past 4 years. This afternoon, 6,500 young men and women will be married. And with inflation at less than half of what it was just 4 years ago, they can look forward with confidence to the future. It's morning again in America. And under the leadership of President Reagan, our country is prouder and stronger and better. Why would we ever want to return to where we were less than 4 short years ago?
Things in the late 1970s were wild for my family.
There's a lot of cocaine in this motherfucker.
Please, no, my folks would never be cool enough to do cocaine. I meant economically. My dad finished college, but when he did, he couldn't find a teaching job anywhere.
Oh? Did you look behind the couch?
So he wound up working as a laborer on construction sites. And, I love my dad, but not the burly construction worker type. He was the office manager on a construction site type. What is worse, we had to move all the time because he was constantly chasing new jobs just to keep the family fed. My parents were fighting a lot over money, and for a hot minute in the late 1970s, it kind of looked like they might be heading for a divorce.
Everyone was doing it. I mean, everyone.
But you know what? In a way, I did get a new dad because everything changed for him when he hit rock bottom and decided to see if he could re-enlist in the Army.
Hey, First Sergeant. Good morning.
You can do it in the Army.
He went down to the recruiting office, and the Army guy was out. But the Air Force recruiter was there, and he was shocked that my dad was thinking of enlisting.
You live like a peasant.
Because, he had a college degree, and he could be an officer and a gentleman in the Air Force, and my dad liked the sound of that.
Was that before or after the movies?
Oh, definitely before the movie, because, you know, if the idea of my dad being a construction worker was unlikely, my dad being Richard Gere is just frankly hilarious. I mean, I love my dad. He's a good enough looking dude, but definitely not Richard Gere level. So after a couple of weeks of paperwork, my old man was selected to go to officer training school for the United States Air Force. OTS was how the Air Force made officers without sending them to the academy. Yeah, they were second-class officers to be sure, but still better than us enlisted folks.
Bloody peasant! Oh, what a giveaway. Did you hear that? Eh?
After 3 months of training, he was officially a second lieutenant, and my family instantly transitioned from barely scraping by to being comfortably middle class. This all transpired between the fall of 1980 and the spring of 1981, so by the time school started in the fall, everything in my life had changed. At the time, I was pretty upset about it. But when Christmas came that year, I started to change my mind real fucking quick. There was nothing like a little bribery to bring one around to a new way of thinking, which is exactly what happened in the United States. We got a better daddy who was handing out a shitload of shiny new toys from under the national Christmas tree. And that's kind of how I'm segueing into talking about Ronald Reagan as president.
He said it!
I told you back in episode 348 how it was Jimmy Carter who took the bullet for doing what needed to be done to take care of inflation by giving political cover to the Fed to raise the interest rates to something like 20%.
What madness is this?
Knocked the country into recession, caused even more unemployment, and, it turned out it was like those shock paddles they used to fix your heart on TV.
Charging and clear.
It got the economic heart beating, and slowly the economy began to recover. Unfortunately, it killed the presidency of Jimmy Carter. Well, that and a few other things, which I will discuss in just a minute. But for old Dutch Reagan, it set him up for a huge win. As we said last week, Reagan had been eyeing the White House run since 1968, ran a primary challenge against Gerald Ford in 76. But come 1980...
he's in it to win it.
Though he'd been out of political office since 1975, Reagan had been working the GOP donors and power brokers behind the scene like a wannabe Hollywood starlet on a casting couch, not unlike Nancy did before she married Dutch.
Allegedly.
By primary season, Reagan was the odds-on favorite before the voting even started. He routinely polled in the high 30s to mid-40s of possible candidates since 1978. When the primary field came together, his closest contender was George H.W. Bush. And by closest, I mean Poppy Bush was actually won a couple of states, 6 to be exact, compared to Reagan's 44, for a total of 637 delegates compared to Ronnie's 1,222. Oh, and about 4 million more popular votes in the total. This was one of the reasons why Poppy was chosen to be Ronnie's VP. That and Ronnie knew fuck all about foreign affairs, but Bush was balls deep in the deep state because he had been the head of the CIA. And at the time, Jimmy Carter, having troubles of his own. Jimmy hadn't made a lot of friends in Congress when he came to Washington, and the entire story is told again in episode 348. But his biggest problem at the time of the election was the Iran hostage crisis, where the Iranian students had seized the U.S. embassy and held the U.S. staff hostage for 444 days. The U.S. public was furious. They called Carter all sorts of things, but most of them were,
fucking pussy.
Because he wouldn't nuke Tehran or something. When a rescue mission was attempted, everything went wrong and damn near needed rescue itself. And all of this caused Ted Kennedy to do to Jimmy what Ronnie had done to Ford in 76. A nasty primary fight, which made an already weakened Carter look that much weaker. Heading into the general election that fall, it was pretty much a foregone conclusion that Carter was going to lose. This, of course, did not mean that Reagan would not pull a Nixon-X rat fuck against Carter just to be sure. You see, after months of negotiations to release the hostages in Tehran going nowhere, exactly 20 minutes after Reagan was sworn in, the hostages were on a plane out of Tehran headed to Algeria and then to West Germany. Some people found the timing of this to be somewhat,
curious.
It was consigned to the nascent conspiracist movement for a few years until it was discovered that the U.S. was selling weapons to Iran in exchange for Iran getting hostages in Lebanon released. And people looked back at that and the thing with the Iranian hostages, and they thought,
Curious, curious.
Numerous investigations, both private and in the form of investigative journalism and public in the form of congressional inquiries, came up short in the old evidence department. That was until the week before this podcast dropped, when an aide to former Texas Governor Conley credibly claimed that he and the governor had a back-channel meeting with the Iranians to keep them from releasing the hostages before the election was over. The question remains open as to whether or not it was an official part of the Reagan campaign, but we all know that it was. The Reagan campaign's 1980 message was elegant and simple.
Everything sucks.
And he knew how to make it not suck. His plan for doing so? Massive military spending, the elimination of government regulations, a 30% reduction in taxes, and a balanced budget in 3 years. These days, we know that it is impossible to achieve a gigantic increase in government spending, unprecedented tax cuts, and not run up a massive budget deficit. But back in 1980, people listen to this and they're like,
sounds great.
But Ronnie had a vision. He was going to make America great again. And it galvanized an untapped source of voters who up until then had largely set out politics, the religious right. Quoting from an article on Salon.com, quote, during the 1980 campaign, Ronald Reagan and the evangelical conservatives engaged in a very public courting ritual. Evangelicals had entertained possible GOP alternatives to Carter since at least 1979. But Reagan, long a darling to conservatives in general, was an especially compelling choice. By the time Moral Majority Executive Director Robert Billings signed on as a Reagan campaign advisor, the deal was pretty much sealed. The 1980 GOP convention gave journalists further reason to believe that the Moral Majority had muscles to flex. Convention delegates approved the GOP's mostly socially conservative platform ever, as the party strengthened its anti-abortion stance and reversed its historical support for the Equal Rights Amendment. On social issues, at least, the pew trumped the country club. It's right down the line an evangelical platform, gushed one Republican at the Detroit convention. Reagan struck an explicitly religious note in his acceptance speech, whereas Carter made no direct mention of God in his, merging established modes of civil religion with a newer rhetoric of anti-secularism. He said, I'll confess that I've been a little bit afraid to suggest what I'm going to suggest, but I'm more afraid not to, declared the nominee. He then paused and said, can we begin our crusade joined together with a moment of silent prayer, unquote. I should point out that Jimmy Carter was an actual evangelical Christian, born and raised and attending an evangelical church every Sunday. Reagan, for all his religious upbringing, was just acting like one. I'm not questioning his belief in God, but he never practiced an evangelical faith. More from Salon, quote, without explicitly saying so, Reagan spoke not of religion in general, but of a traditional, that is, conservative faith in need of protection. Such a move did not require the religiously amorphous Reagan to consistently identify as an evangelical. As the frontrunner, Reagan ignored matters of labeling and reiterated his reliance on prayer, unquote. The religious right was useful to Reagan, though Reagan was less useful to the religious right than they'd hoped. They'd hoped to get Roe overturned, put prayer back in schools, and have gays put in concentration camps.
Hashtag dream big.
But they had to settle for smaller victories like ignoring the AIDS crisis and killing gays a little bit slower. When the voting was done, it was a landslide. Reagan carried 44 states and garnered roughly 8 million more popular votes than Carter, winning the Electoral College 489 to 49. The only election more embarrassing for Democrats came 4 years later when Reagan whipped Mondale like a high-priced dominatrix whips a Republican senator.
Like that, don't you, bitch?
Reagan took office on January of 1981 with a lot of political capital, but a Congress completely controlled by Democrats, which you might think would be a problem for him, but you'll be wrong, as we shall see, as we turn to what Reagan did to the country. And I want to warn you, what I'm about to tell you now is not pretty. If you have children while you're at home, while you're listening to this, first of all, why? Second of all, if you do, you might want to wear headphones because I'm about to get explicit. It was called trickle-down economics.
Oh, God, he's peeing on me.
Which I'll admit sounds like a golden shower, which is probably why Reaganomics became the preferred nomenclature. Either way, someone was pissing in your face and telling you it was raining. Wikipedia describes Reaganomics as, quote, 4 simple principles: lower marginal tax rates, less regulation, restrain government spending, non-inflationary monetary policy, unquote. This, on the surface, sounds reasonable. But let me explain the real meaning behind it. Rich people got huge fucking tax breaks. Middle class people got some tax breaks. And poor people
just got fucked.
Starting in 1981, because of Reagan's new tax plan, the wealthy and corporations kept more of the money they made. We were told that they would spend that money on creating jobs for the rest of us. This is not what happened. Because what did happen was, surprise, surprise, rich people kept the fucking money and used it to buy mansions, yachts, private jets, islands where they could hunt and kill poor people for sport. You know, that kind of thing. Now, what did the middle class get out of Reaganomics?
Credit card debt, credit card debt.
Well, it was all kinds of debt, really. You see, the other part of Reagan's policies were massive reductions in the regulations the government put in place to keep corporations from fucking you with a splintered log dildo every chance they got. Regulations regarding the financial industry were lifted, allowing all kinds of predatory lending to take place. Banks could now make mortgages that rose and fell with interest rates, and removed many of the blocks that kept Wall Street from doing any fucking thing they wanted to so long as the stock prices rose. And that was just the beginning of Reagan's plan for the federal government. All those annoying regulations that said corporations had to do things like not pollute or sell you poison food and medication. Well, those were just
gone.
From a Rolling Stone article written in 1982, 1 year into Ronnie's Brave New World. Quote, since Reagan took office, the law enforcement actions taken by the Food and Drug Administration have dropped 65%. The FDA, once regarded as the toughest regulatory agency, has simply stopped policing faulty drugs, adulterated foods, and false labeling with its old vigor. During the Carter administration, the FDA averaged 530 enforcement actions every 6 months. In the first 6 months of 1982, by contrast, the FDA took only 178 actions against products whose safety and effectiveness the agency is supposed to guarantee. In the past, the FDA would take 260 products off the shelf in a 6-month period. The first half of this year, it seized only 94, unquote. Nor was it just the FDA. The Environmental Protection Agency was gutted. So the regulations that did exist simply weren't enforced because no one was there to investigate violations. If you got hurt on the job, OSHA was decimated. Again from Rolling Stone, quote, OSHA cut safety inspection of workplaces by 25% this year. But the really drastic gutting has been on the enforcement and penalties. The issuance of willful citations, which carry fines of up to $10,000, is down 89%, while the total amount of penalties levied against employers is down 70%. In the last year of the Carter administration, OSHA averaged $2,049,000 in penalties every month. Under Reagan, the average was $612,000 a month in 1982, unquote. And the Justice Department just stopped investigating discrimination complaints. The Federal Trade Commission stopped pretty much everything. And the Department of Agriculture cut back on meat inspections in slaughterhouses. And this was the first fucking year. And there were 7 more years of Reagan and 4 more years of Bush to come. In 1983, the Reagan White House commissioned a report on education in the United States.
This ought to be good.
The commission released a report called A Nation at Risk, where it found, as quoted from the Washington Post, quote, some 23 million American adults are functionally illiterate by the simplest test of everyday reading, writing, and comprehension. About 13% of all 17-year-olds in the United States can be considered functionally illiterate. Functional illiteracy among minority youth may run as high as 40%. The report included a long list of recommendations to improve public schools, including the adoption of rigorous standards, state and local tests to measure achievement, stronger graduation standards, sufficient financial resources, and curriculum changes to give students a solid grounding in basic subjects as well as art and computer science. The bumbling began immediately. Reagan startled the commission members by hailing their call for prayer in schools, school vouchers, and the abolition of the Department of Education. The commission hadn't said a word about any of these things. Indeed, the commission had been launched by the Secretary of Education, Terrell Bell, to fend off the president's 1980 campaign proposal to abolish the department. In its report, it laid out a strong argument in favor of a vigorous federal presence in education to support vulnerable students, aid higher education research, and protect civil rights. These suggestions were quickly relegated to the dustbin of history, unquote. The Reagan White House attacked teachers' unions, cut federal aid to schools, and tried to kill the Department of Education by slashing its funding. And the only thing it gave in return to teachers was blowing one of them up on the fucking space shuttle. Reagan gutted the unions. His fire into the air traffic controllers and crippling the National Labor Relations Board kicked off the slow declines of unions in the United States. When Reagan took office, 1/4 of the workforce was unionized. When he left, 1/6 of it was, and it just went downhill from there. Reagan's influence also spurred the increase of right-to-work laws in the states, which led to further dilutions of the union's influence. It's widely held that the damage done to unions by Reagan is one of the major reasons why the middle class is so fucked today. The poor were always fucked, if you're keeping score. Mostly because Reagan gutted the welfare system and launched a systemic attack on the very idea of the social safety net. He tried real hard to cut Social Security, but that was a bridge too far, even for him and his most ardent supporters. And then there's the military. And after Vietnam, our national appetite for spending all of our treasure on massive military investments was at an all-time low. You can imagine why. The 70s were tough on the military-industrial complex. Congress slashed military budgets and no one wanted to be in the military. This made the Pentagon...
How sad. How very sad.
But Uncle Ronnie was here to wipe those tears away because Uncle Ronnie had this crazy idea. If we couldn't beat the Russians on the battlefield, since, we weren't actually fighting them on any battlefields, we could beat them with a credit card. We would spend so much money the Soviets couldn't possibly compete, and we would bankrupt them. This is essentially what did happen. But since Ronnie had slashed taxes, remember those huge tax cuts that I mentioned? Even with his draconian cuts to social spending, the money we needed to buy all those ships and bombers and missiles and space lasers had to come from somewhere. And where did it come from? It was borrowed from the future. By running up the deficit in a way not seen since World War II when we were actually fighting a fucking war, which in the 1980s, we were not, unless you count invading Grenada, which I don't, because it was fucking silly. This is how the Washington Post put it in a 2004 article about Reagan's build-up. Quote, military officials in both the United States and the Soviet Union were bluffing about one another's capabilities to help fuel a push for more weapons, said Pierre Spray, a Pentagon consultant in the 70s and 80s. What we had was two huge defense apparatuses busily propagandizing their governments to spend the absolute maximum amount of money, said Spray, who was a prominent group of reformers inside and outside the Pentagon who argued against increasing military spending. It wasn't a buildup, it was just a spend-up, Spray said. Reagan gave money to defense contractors for weapons while funds for troops, maintenance, and training languished. For example, not only did Reagan approve construction of the costly B-2 bomber, Spray said, he also resurrected the B-1 bomber, a problem-plagued program that the Air Force didn't want and the Carter administration had canceled, unquote. In short, it pumped money into the pockets of defense contractors, who in turn pumped money into the pockets of Reagan and GOP election coffers, forming the human centipede of corruption and graft that continues to this very day. And look, I haven't even touched on the egregious social policies like the war on drugs, the slow-moving genocide of the Reagan AIDS policy, or how Reagan fought against sanctions and divestiture in South Africa because he was down with apartheid, or how the Reagan administration was way more corrupt than even fucking Richard Nixon. I mean, Iran-Contra was straight up an impeachable offense, and Reagan got the fuck away with it. His entire administration was full of corrupt motherfuckers. 138 administration officials were either arrested, indicted, or investigated for criminal acts during his 8 years in office. The most in history, even compared to the Trump administration. Though with the Trump administration, that's probably because the corruption of the Trump administration was so pervasive, it kept the investigations from happening at all. And I could go on for another 20 or 30 minutes on all the horrible shit Reagan did that fundamentally fucked up this country in ways that we are still dealing with today. But in spite of all of those things.
Hey, everybody else likes him. I like him too. Everybody loves him.
And nothing could stick to him. And you're probably wondering,
why is that?
Yeah, why is that?
The simple reason is his policies, they kind of worked. The first 2 years of administration were rough. I mean, John Hinckley Jr. shot his ass.
And aim better this time!
That didn't have anything to do with his policies, but surviving John Hinckley Jr. shooting his ass got him a lot of goodwill from the American public that he was able to parlay into patience on their part for his promised reforms to work. And they did in the short run, because you see, after inflation finally fell, because of the interest rate hikes, and the corporations began to benefit from being left to run fuck wild through the economy, and Wall Street being told,
If it feels good, do it. If it feels bad, do it again.
there was a lot more money running around out there. It seemed like it was trickling down, and at first people were like, fuck yeah, it's trickling down, Reaganomics works. And since the economy is basically chaos magic, when the American people felt like they were doing better, they did do better. By 84, unemployment was down, inflation was gone, Wall Street was booming, and everyone was feeling fucking great, especially if they were doing cocaine, which everyone was, except for my parents. The mid-1980s economic boom felt so good. The entire country was buying Walkman on credit cards, and the only thing bigger than our hair was our self-confidence. The good times were never going to end, and man, the man we had to thank for that was Ronald Wilson Reagan. It was morning again in America, and goddamn it, it's going to be a great fucking day for about 5 years. And then the bills started to come due. The country and the citizens realized that you really can't put a military expansion or massive cocaine purchase on a credit card, because eventually you're going to have to pay that off. But you know what? Ronnie didn't care. He was out of office, and because he had fucking Alzheimer's, he didn't even remember he'd done it. I'm not saying that Reagan wasn't an evil fuck. I'm just saying that there's questions about who was really behind the thinking, such as it was, that went into the Reagan administration, and that would be a whole other 2-part podcast set. But if you just want it summed down, they were all in office during the George W. Bush administration. The reason I spent so much time talking about the economic side of the Reagan presidency, a subject I don't understand, other than to know that it didn't fucking work, is because Reaganomics are still being touted today. It was the one thing that stuck in the tiny fucking minds of the GOP, is that we should keep doing what Reagan did, only
more so.
And it's more than just the GOP. The Reagan Revolution convinced Democrats that the way they could win was to be more RWR than FDR. So that's how we got Bill Clinton, who, when he wasn't busy chasing pussy, gave us welfare reform, which made it damn near impossible for people to get the help they need. Government regulations are still the boogeyman of Washington, D.C., and that's why in 2008, the entire world economy shit the bed and had to be bailed out at taxpayer expense, and why in 2023, the banks are still fucking around and finding out new ways to get their fuck up paid for by Uncle Sugar. But hey, you still personally have to pay for those student loan debts, which is another thing you can thank Ronald Reagan for, because guess when college prices started their climb to the peak of insanity? I think you know the answer. So many other things. Like, I can't directly blame September 11th on Reagan, but I'm sure his fucking grubby dick beaters are on there somehow. I mean, Cheney and Rumsfeld right there. I don't know. There, I managed to blame fucking September 11th on Reagan. It took 15 to 20 years, but the evidence became abundantly clear that everything that is wrong in America today started under Ronald fucking Reagan, including the polarization that's nudging us ever so slightly and ever so steadily towards a second civil war, because Ronnie went and killed off any kind of government oversight on what all these Christian fascist motherfuckers were saying on the radio, where they're preaching genocide 24/7, leading directly to their inbred fucking kids preaching genocide on Twitter 24/7. You want something a little bit less important but more personal? The reason Ticketmaster can dry fuck you for your Taylor Swift tickets is because Reagan gutted antitrust regulations. If it is broke in America, Reagan broke it, and because he gets teeny GOP dick slightly less limp, No one fixed anything. And Democrats have forgotten what it is like to actually do their fucking job and help people because Ronnie was so goddamn popular and they wanted to be popular, so they were more like fucking Reagan. So yeah, it's morning again in America, but in our case, it's 3 o'clock in the morning. We've been awake all goddamn night worried because we didn't have enough money to make the rent this fucking month. That is what the Gipper gave you.
This message comes from Greenlight. Ready to start talking to your kids about financial literacy? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app that teaches kids and teens how to earn, save, spend wisely, and invest with your guardrails in place. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Join millions of parents and kids building healthy financial habits together on Greenlight. Get started risk-free at greenlight.com/Spotify.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
That is it for our show this week and wrapping up our 2-parter on old fucking Dutch Reagan. I could have done a whole other episode on the social policies that Reagan inflicted on us. The AIDS crisis alone is a good 2-parter. I didn't, so you should look for that in the future because content, baby. Content. Ow! We got some goofy shit coming up for the next couple of weeks. We're going to put out some heavy stuff, so it's time to take it down a notch. So, we got that going for you. You should look forward to that. Thanks again to everyone who helped out for 400 and everyone who donates to my Patreon, patreon.com/whatthehellpodcast. If you can't kick us a buck or just don't want to, leave us a review somewhere. You can even write it on a bathroom stall. It helps others find the show and realize they should avoid anything they find in a bathroom stall.
Is that a glory hole?
Do all the things Jeremy tells you to do in the closing credits, otherwise he will be forced to deregulate our podcast feed, and then before you know it, it'll just be polluted by old feeds of a Battlestar Galactica podcast I did in 2004. So for me, Dave, money's too tight to mention. I can't get an unemployment extension. Bledsoe, producer,
we talk about Reaganomics, oh Lord, down in the Congress. They're passing all kinds of bills.
Gavin, and all the fictional Reagan Democrats on this show, we want to say we're talking about the dollar bill and that old man that's over the hill. Now, what are we all to do when money got a hold on you? And we'll see you all next week.
What the Hell Were You Thinking stars Dave Bledsoe and features Gavin St. James and several fictional minions. The show is produced by Kimberly Steele and a part of the Seltzer Kings podcast network. You can find more information on the show on their website, whatthehellpodcast.com, or on Twitter at @thehell_podcast, or on Facebook as What the Hell Podcast. Thanks for listening.
I have no ending for this, so I take a small bow.
Initials I and C? Iran-Contra?
Seltzer Kings
Podcasts.